In a world where you can be anything, be kind. It's a famous saying, and it sounds simple enough, but when it comes to work, this isn't just a nice to have. In the UK alone, mental health problems cost employers £51 billion per year. Today we answer the big question, can you be kind and high performing?
He looked at me and said, you've got no idea. I said, what do you mean?
Mental health and wellbeing is really personal, so you can't create a one-size-fits-all policy.
If you spent 36 years avoiding public speaking because of panic attacks, how are you getting through this conference talk right now without having a panic attack? And honestly, I nearly had a panic attack.
It wouldn't work out, I would feel depressed, I would feel angry, then I would start getting hope again, only to go through that cycle again.
Hello everyone and welcome to The Green Room by Deloitte. I'm Annie Wong and I'm joined by my wonderful co-host Lizzie Elson.
Hello.
And we are back with a brand new season and some very exciting guests. Hopefully you found time to listen to our 5-part mini-series Bigger Questions, where we focused on 4 stories of barrier breaking with some amazing Olympians and Paralympians, and it was voiced by BBC Sports' Andrew Cotter. So if you haven't had a chance, please do go and listen. You can find it right here on the Green Room podcast feed or wherever you get your pods. Today we're back with our regular episodes and we're talking about whether or not you can be both kind and high performing. Often they're seen as two sides of the same coin, but do they actually go hand in hand? We'll be talking about how important it is to look after your own personal well-being and others, and the role that businesses and leaders can play in that as well. Lizzie, as always, we can't do this alone, so who have we got with us in the studio today?
I'm so delighted to introduce our 2 guests today. So we have with us David Beeney, founder of Breaking the Silence and mental health consultant, and now author of a book by the same name too. David, welcome. It's fabulous to have you.
Thank you, great to be here.
And we're also joined by Liz Hampson, who is a life sciences and health innovation partner at Deloitte, as well as the leader of the Deloitte Health Equity Institute. Welcome, Liz.
Thank you.
So without further ado, let's get stuck in and let's have a look at chat first of all perhaps around personal stories and some of your motivations. And David, you're incredibly open and honest about your own personal struggles that you've had in the past. And for those who don't know you or your work, can you tell us a little bit about your story, your background, and why you do the work that you do now?
Thank you. Yeah, my name is David Beeney. I spent most of my career working in magazines and newspapers, not as a journalist. I'm always keen to say, I don't know why. At one stage, I was the managing director of the Evening Telegraph in Northamptonshire, and I spent many years as a commercial director for Auto Trader. But throughout that 36-year career, I had a big secret, a really, really big secret. And what was my secret? My secret was I was battling in private with my mental health. Even I'm surprised when I look back at my life that nobody knew about it. And I'm really sad to admit that includes my ex-wife of 28 years, had no idea. My mates down the pub had no idea. And nobody I worked with knew about my constant battles with panic attacks and anxiety. But on the 16th of May 2016, my life changed forever when I outed myself for the very first time about my mental health. And it's proved to be one of the best things I've ever done in my life. When I first shared my story, it resonated with more people and at a deeper level than anything I've ever done before. However, what surprised me was that how many people came up to me and said, David, can I be honest with you too? And I said, yes. And they said things to me like, I would never ever share with my employer my true mental health because I think it would damage my career. And the more and more people I shared with about my own mental health, the more people basically said to me they didn't trust their employers. So I made a big decision back at the beginning of 2017 that where I wanted to focus my energy was helping employers to become kinder. I wanted to help employers to create cultures in their workplaces where every single employee would feel safe to be really honest about their mental health. I also knew this isn't a fluffy subject because I believe when you create a kinder culture, your best people are less likely to leave, less people go off sick, and you create greater energy in the organisation. My decision back in 2017 to focus on workplace culture has led me on a hell of a journey since then, and I feel very, very lucky to do the sort of work that I do. To give you a brief flavour of my work, I work with the Royal Navy. I'm trying to help them to get rid of their macho culture to make it easier for our sailors to be honest about their mental health. I'm not political, never have been, never will be, but I work with the Labour Party on trying to help them to create a kinder culture within their own party. And I work with some amazing brands.
Do you mind me asking what made you out to yourself, as you put it, on that date in March?
I wish I had a better story. About 10 years ago, I qualified as a mental health counsellor. But but just to work one evening a week for the charity Mind. And someone at Auto Trader within the HR team had obviously become aware that I was got a passion about mental health. And in April 2016 said to me, David, next month is Mental Health Awareness Week. Would you mind doing some talks in London and Manchester about mental health? I think our staff would love to hear it from you. I remember hoping it would go away. And the very following day, I got an email saying, David, thank you for agreeing to do these talks in London and Manchester. Please, can you send me your slide deck? I'm really interested to see what you're going to talk about. And I thought, well, so am I. What slide deck? I sat at home one evening and I thought to myself, I know what I'll do. I'll talk about myself and I'll share my own story. And as I say, that decision saved my life.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. It's fascinating, and we'll get more into kind of what your observations have been and what employers can also be doing to support their businesses. Elizabeth, you're the Health Policy Advisory Lead here at Deloitte, and wondered if you could explain a little bit more about your role and why it matters to you.
I've been working with health policy, so government policy makers, for 15 years, also with leading charities like Mind, who are our charity partner, for 6 years. I'm the relationship lead for Place to Be, who are children and young people's mental health charity in schools. And I also work with life sciences organisations and other charities. And my work is about trying to improve access to health innovation and health outcomes for all. And one of the really neglected areas historically has been mental health. And in my first ever project about 15 years ago, I started to learn about how neglected mental health was versus physical health. I was looking at mental health support services in the NHS versus ophthalmology, which is actually one of the most common operations, cataract operations. And I was lucky to attend conferences and start to understand the link between mental and physical health and how neglected it was as an area. So I've been really passionate about that area since, and have had the opportunity to work on a lot of different pieces related to that with different charities, and involved in the Thriving at Work review, which was the Stevenson Pharma report that looked at mental health and employers about 6 years ago. So I've done lots of work in that space, but also it's important to me personally. You know, if I look back growing up, I probably had a lot of social anxiety, but I didn't realise that at the time. I didn't have that name. I wasn't really aware that was what's happening. And then when my husband and I were trying to have children, we had lots of miscarriages. We had 4 miscarriages in a short period of time. And I would just watch myself get excited, think it was going to work out. It wouldn't work out. I would feel depressed. I would feel angry. Then I would start getting hope again, only to go through that cycle again. And I was very quiet about it at work to start with, as I think, you know, most people are. There's a bit of a stigma still, less so now, but there's still a bit of a stigma around miscarriage. So I didn't say so much. But after a little while, it was quite clear that I couldn't really hide it any longer. So I shared it with a few people. And then I had a bit of a support network in work. And it made a really big difference. And actually, it taught me about the importance of really looking after yourself through that period, because I found a therapist who I spoke to on a weekly basis and made sure I looked after myself, and I learned a lot in that process, and I think I'm probably a better parent because of it.
That's fascinating. Golly, it's so interesting, isn't it, when you think about the amount of time that is spent at work, and that was such an enormous part of you and who you were at the time, for work not to know. So brave of you to share it, and David, obviously for you back in that time, back in March, when you shared your own story.
Liz, you mentioned that you've seen the stigma around miscarriage specifically reduce over time while you've been at work. Would you say that the stigma around mental health more broadly has also reduced? Like, what's your experience been? Have you seen a shift?
I've seen a definite shift. I think particularly the pandemic made a big difference, because it became really obvious that you needed to support people's mental health through what was a very traumatic period for everyone in this country. And I think that really shifted things. But there's a lot of work, you know, David and others have done breaking the taboos and breaking the stigma over a number of years, which I think is translating into people being more open about it.
Having heard another podcast, David, that you were on, and I heard what you said about if somebody has a physical problem and they go off sick, for example, with a broken leg, and they get cards and people check in with them from work, but if it's for a mental health reason, people are reluctant to check in, and for fear of saying the wrong thing perhaps, or just the stigma associated with it. I don't know if you had anything to add on that.
I use that story. If 2 people go off at the same time, they used to go on very different journeys. We care about them both the same, but with the person with mental health, we don't know what to say. So we end up saying nothing. We convince ourselves they want to be left alone. with the irony being they probably need more love and support than the person who's got a physical health issue. It's getting better. I think there has been some progress with stigma in recent years, but I think we've got a really, really long way to go. When I talk at a conference, my final slide is a big version of my business card. And I finished a session somewhere recently, and someone came up to me on the way out of the room and said, do you take feedback? And we all know when someone says that, you think, well, what have I done? And this guy said to me, you should have put some business cards around the room. And I said, business cards? I said, I've got some at home somewhere tucked away in a drawer, but I don't think I've used them since before the pandemic. And I said, hang on a minute, I've got a really big business card on the screen at the moment. And he looked at me and said, you've got no idea. I said, what do you mean? He said, I wanted to get my phone out and take a photograph of your big slide, but I didn't want anyone else in the room to see me doing that. So here we are in 2024, you know, all this work around mental health stigma, and people are still embarrassed to be seen, to be taking down my contact details. So there has been some good progress made, but there's still a long, long way to go.
And just sort of to finish off a little bit around your sort of personal stories, and perhaps for both of you, has the work that you do actually helped your own personal sort of challenges that you've had, and is there anything else, either inside or outside your work, that has helped you better navigate those feelings?
I spent 36 years in corporate life doing everything possible to avoid public speaking because of my battles with panic attacks, and I now do talks almost every day. So it wasn't surprising that when I was doing one of my first ever big conference talks, I think it was in Manchester, someone in the audience put their hand up, and they left their hand up. And I said, yes. And they said, David, I'm so sorry to interrupt your talk, but please can I ask you a question right now? I said, go on then. And they said, if you spent 36 years avoiding public speaking because of panic attacks, how are you getting through this conference talk right now without having a panic attack? And honestly, I nearly had a panic attack.
Wow, I'm not surprised.
From memory, I said two things. Firstly, I said I can't promise any group of people I'm ever with that I won't have a panic attack, because I still have them. And secondly, there's a phrase that we associate with mental health, that it's okay not to be okay. And maybe for the first time in my life, I've accepted, well, 8 years ago, that it's okay not to be okay. And I'm finally comfortable being me. So is that how I get through sessions even like this one? I think it helps. I don't think it's the main reason. Something else also helped me about 7 or 8 years ago. I got involved with a graduate selection day in London. And as part of the selection process, the graduates had to come out and do a presentation about something they were passionate about. And I sat in the audience on this day, and I thought these graduates were amazing. I was quite jealous. One of them spoke about her love for horses. Another graduate talked about skiing. But then Abigail came to the front of the room. And Abigail came to the front and said, hi, everybody. My name's Abigail, and I've got bipolar. And for the first time that day, people stopped whispering. For the first time that day, the room went silent, and we all hung on to Abigail's every single word. And without exception, the first name we all wrote down was Abigail, because what we saw her do was inspire people by sharing vulnerability. Trust me, earlier in my career, if I'd have talked about my battles with mental health, I would have been seen as a liability, as a weak link. But times are changing. These days, when we share vulnerability, we're inspiring people around us to be their authentic selves too. So is that how I get through my sessions without a panic attack? Because I think inspiring people, again, I think it helps. I don't think it's the main reason. I've tried to find a cure to my panic attacks for over 4 decades. And cure's a good word to use, because I've accepted I'll never be cured. I had my last panic attack doing a session only about 3 weeks ago. But I think I've realised these days what happens on the vast majority of occasions when I feel the demons returning and I find myself becoming panicky. I actually sit here and I say to myself, sod it, just have one. Show you right now what it looks like for me to sit here and have a panic attack. The irony is, the moment I give myself authentic permission to have one, I massively reduce the chances of them happening. I've spent most of my career panicking about my panic attacks, getting anxious about my anxiety. I've always been really hard on myself. I thought I had to be perfect every day. In our careers, we often talk about raising the bar. Well, I've lowered my bar. I haven't lowered my standards. I haven't lowered my aspirations. I think I've discovered the true value of self-compassion, which is about being kinder to yourself. And I believe when you become kinder to yourself, 2 things happen. One, you bring down your levels of stress because you're not putting yourself under so much pressure. And secondly, you become more productive and creative too, because when you function with a more relaxed state of mind, you get greater clarity of thought. And when you get greater clarity of thought, you tend to get a lot more things done. So my discovery of becoming kinder to me has been the biggest step forward in my life in terms of both my well-being and what I'm achieving. And when we go on to talk about later the impact of being kinder in the workplace, imagine if everyone lowered their bar and had greater clarity of thought and felt more productive and more creative. And that's why this isn't a fluffy subject.
No, absolutely. And we'll it's very much not a fluffy subject, and we'll come on later, I think, to the business case behind all of this as well, because there is absolutely one. And Liz, perhaps a slightly different question for you, but just in terms of how you actively champion mental well-being in your line of work, what's your experience of focusing on this, both kind of in the firm and also with clients over the years?
Well, I think that over the years it's become a bigger focus area for the discussions. But particularly thinking about employee health, mental health has been a really big part, but I think we're thinking about other aspects of health and well-being today as well. And I speak with a lot of clients on that, talking about where we think the big gaps are in employee health and how we can move them. I've also had a role within the firm for a long time, both within the area that I work and also advising around what we're seeing as external trends around well-being space. And it's felt a real privilege to be able to do that and to work with some of the clients that we have. And a little bit like David, I think that point about being really passionate about what you do can take you to a little bit further than you're expecting, but also that element of self-compassion and having a learner's mindset and accepting your mistakes is really important to be able to do your best work. I completely concur with what you said there.
We've touched on the workplace a little bit around the role of employers, what they need to be doing to create that safe space. And there's a Deloitte report around mental health and employers that's got a stat that says that the cost of mental health problems not being kind of supported and addressed is £51 billion per year, which is just astronomical. What are some of those challenges? What makes up that cost? What is it? Is it people not coming to work because they just need more headspace, they need time? Is it that they are coming to work but they don't feel like they can be themselves? And to your point, David, then they're not getting the most out of their, productivity in their time. What is that cost made up of, and what are those challenges?
That report, that's the fourth in the series, and the first one was done in support of the Thriving at Work review. And apart from the last year, the costs have been going up and up each year, and part of that is wage inflation and etc. But a lot of that is untackled mental health issues. And what we see is that although people's mental health has improved a little bit post the pandemic, it hasn't improved as much as it needed to. And actually children and young people's mental health, there's now 1 in 5 children and young people that has a probable mental health condition. So this is a really, really big issue for us as a society, and we're not investing enough in it. And one of the things that we try and do with the report is really highlight the hard business case around the issue, in case anyone thinks it's a fluffy subject. And of that 51 billion, over half is presenteeism. And presenteeism is when people come to work, but they aren't able to work at their best. Now, some people want to come to work. Some people would be better off if they stayed at home, but they're generally not able to work at their best. And we think that it's about a 25% or 30% reduction on average of efficiency. Then there's absence, so people taking time off due to mental health. And then the second largest category, much bigger than absence, is actually people leaving their jobs. So this is leaving their jobs because they feel like they can't have good mental health where they need to move employers, or they need to do something, they need to change something in their lives. And that's a big cost as well. And that actually went up a lot during the pandemic because people became much more aware of the relationship between work and their mental health. Now, the other thing that we looked at this year for the first time was the cost to employers of children and young people's poor mental health. Now, that's about 8 billion. And we asked, and almost 50% of parents at the moment are concerned about their child's mental health. And about half of them say it has an impact on work. And that impact might be taking days off to care for them, being less productive at work, and in some cases, changing jobs. So they can be closer to home, have better hours. That's actually, we found 1 in 100 people, working parents who left their job last year, did so entirely due to their child's mental health. So that, I think, is just a really, really big issue that we need to be doing more about in society.
And I think, the benefits to the individual are obvious through investment in mental health. But Liz, I wondered if you could share sort of any evidence that investment makes good financial return as well for an organisation.
This is still something that's really understudied, but from our review, what we find is that for every pound spent, you get almost £5 back in return. And the better returns are actually around education and cultural intervention. So the more proactive and preventative you are, the better return on your money.
Liz, I want to go back to something you said earlier around the amount of people who have left their job because of mental health problems. And I was reflecting, and part of me thought that's actually a really positive thing, because it's people recognising this employer is not doing what I need. I need something else. I need a better environment, so I'm going to find it elsewhere. But then it's also quite disheartening, because that means that employers and organisations can be doing so much more. And in your experience, where have you seen employers responding really well, and what is it that they are doing to create those kind of cultures for all of their people?
Yeah, I think employers that are doing a good job are actually really honest with themselves about what the impact their work environment has on their employees, and thinks about the fact that everyone is going to need something different. So mental health and wellbeing is really personal. So you can't create a one-size-fits-all policy. You have to think about how are you supporting your employees in different ways. And I think historically, employers thought, oh, we have an employee assistance program, they can call us if they have any problems, that's sufficient. And employers have been moving earlier and earlier towards thinking about culture and education and supporting line managers and breaking the stigma and having more vocal leaders on these topics. And it's those types of things, thinking about being more not reactive, but actually proactively and preventative, and looking at how they can support their employees in that earlier stage. So things like when young people are joining the organisation for the first time, how are they supporting them with that transition? Because transitions are always really difficult periods for people. So how do they support them in a promotion transition, or how do they support them when they're joining? Or even people who are retiring, how do they support them into retirement? So I think it's thinking about that whole life of the employee, and actually being really open and questioning yourself and getting the right data and listening to people and responding to it. And I think what we see is that people are much more open to a wide range of interventions. So before the pandemic, we saw about a third of people would be open and interested to use digital health support. Now it's over 50%. So actually the way that you have to provide support is really changing as well.
That's interesting. I mean, your point about culture there is sort of at the heart of all of this, isn't it? And David, you're out talking to organisations all the time about that point. What is it that you're sort of advising them when it comes to culture? How do organisations change or evolve to support their employees?
I could use the military as a bit of an example. They've got world-class resource available to our military personnel, the best resource in the world. But if you haven't got the right culture where people feel safe to ask for help, it doesn't get used. So the key things for me around workplace culture, the tone has to come from the very top of the organisation. There's still a lot of tick boxing going on when it comes to mental health from the most senior people, who aren't seeing this as a topic that is going to directly link with the performance of the overall organisation. But line manager education to me is absolutely key, because you can work for a brilliant organisation with a great culture, but if you've got a crap boss, you don't get that experience. Most people I talk to, we've all had a bad line manager, and we know what that feels like. So line manager education is absolutely critical, and line managers understanding again that this is not a fluffy subject, I'm going to say it again, but it's linked to getting the best out of your people. A very, very well-known global bank with a fantastic reputation around well-being, they did a survey of 76,000 staff, and they asked them lots of questions on this topic, but one question was very black and white. And it simply said, do we care about you, yes or no? And they put that question in because they were confident that most staff would say yes, because they've got this great reputation. Guess what? 38,000 staff said no. 50% of their workforce said, you don't care about me. Now, luckily, they're brilliant with their data analytics, brilliant. They dived into the data and they went looking for a common denominator, and they found it straight away. And it won't surprise you with what I'm saying, the common denominator was your line manager. They then drilled further into the data to see what does a manager do or not do to make people think we don't care about them. And what came out of it was really basic stuff. And number one was the managers who created this impression they didn't care about you, whenever they started a work conversation with you, whether a team meeting or a one-to-one, they always started conversations by just talking about work. And I've seen it so evidence-based myself firsthand that where we start more work conversations by what I call the power of how are you and not talking about work is one of the best ways to create a culture at work where you get more from your staff. I think line manager education is critical. I think the tone has to come from the top, are two of the key things around culture.
Just on that, I find it really interesting because I worry that line managers, particularly in our line of work, Lizzie, they have, metrics, KPIs, performance, they're under so much pressure. What's your view that if their own mental health is suffering and they are struggling, how does that limit their capacity to then support other people? And the idea of, putting on your own seatbelt first, looking after yourself before you are able to look after others. How much of that do you think is driving line managers' inability to support others?
Critical in their training, the first half of my workshops with managers is about their own mental well-being, because too many managers are still driving themselves too hard. And it goes back again, they've got to realise that self-care is not selfish. They've got to realise it's evidence-based that when you take breaks and when you take regular holidays, you'll achieve more than if you don't. And so we have to support everyone in organisations, but particularly managers and leaders, with regards to helping them to understand what they need to do to maintain good mental resilience. Critical.
Yeah, I agree. I think leaders have two roles, don't they? One is about role modelling on this topic and how they care for themselves, but then also thinking about how they're looking after themselves in a way that they're able to support and see others. Because to be kind, you have to have good emotional intelligence. You have to be in a space where you can see what's going on, or at least willing to ask and be accountable for hearing the answer with other people.
Cook for Good is one of the social enterprises that Deloitte supports through our 5 Million Futures programme. Cook for Good tackles food insecurity, social isolation and barriers to work on a social housing estate in King's Cross in London. They run team-building cooking experiences with corporate teams making meals to share with local residents and outreach organisations. All profits are then used to fund a community programme, which includes free cooking classes, employment programmes and a surplus food pantry. To find out more or to book your own team cooking experience, head to cookforgood.uk. If we sort of look a bit more at this idea of kindness, because I'm sure there are still some who sort of think kind, that's a bit fluffy, isn't it? And I know we've addressed this idea of fluffiness and it's not, but I just wondered if we could explore a few more aspects of that and what it means to be kind. And David, I've heard you speak about asking people, how are you? Which often almost becomes like a hello, and you don't ever really get a true response. I wondered if you could just talk a bit about that, because that's another thing, I guess, that people can be doing.
One of the simplest things we can do is when we ask somebody how they are, is to ask them twice. Because invariably when you say to someone, how are you? They'll say, fine, they're great.
Yeah.
But if you look them in the eye and say, how are you really? It's interesting how you often get a more honest response. I'll give you two very quick examples of me using this recently. A guy comes in to see me. I said, hi, how are you? And he said, yeah. He said, I'm great. He said, it was my birthday this weekend. And I said, well, happy birthday for the weekend, but how are you really? And he went very quiet on me and he said, my brother died on my birthday last year. He said, it's actually been a really, really difficult few days, but thank you for asking. If I hadn't have asked him twice, I'd known nothing about his brother dying on his birthday last year. Another chap comes in to see me and he's the classic big personality of the department. Big voice, big smile. And he walked into the room and I said, hi, how are you? And he said, I'm great. And I said, how are you really? And he looked at me and said, do you really want to know? I said, well, that's why I said, how are you really? And he said, I'm not great at all. In fact, I'm really, really struggling. And he really opened up to me about what was going on in his world at the moment. If I hadn't have asked him twice, I wouldn't have known that. There are simple things we can do to in terms of trying to get people to open up. We can share our own vulnerability, because I think people mirror behaviour, and when we share, we give other people permission to share. We can, as I say, ask people twice. A huge part of my training as a counsellor is also to notice, not interpret. What we tend to do in life with people we love and care about, we sit there for hours and hours and hours going round and round in our heads trying to work out what's going on. The problem is when you try and interpret behaviour, it's very easy to make someone feel judged. But we are allowed to notice change. If you were a great mate of mine living down the road in Harpenden and you were normally pretty easygoing, but just recently had started snapping at me, I am allowed to say to you, I care about you. I've noticed recently you become quite irritable. Is everything okay? And because I'm noticing a change in your behaviour and not judging you, you're more likely to open up and tell me what's going on in your world at the moment.
I really like the simple, kind of tangible example of just asking someone how you are twice. I feel like that's something we can all do, everyone listening, everyone here. It's such a simple thing and so powerful. I'd love to hear some more. I feel like I just want more.
Right, I'll give you another simple one, which works. A global language we all understand in every country in the world is the language of 1 to 10. We all know that 7 out of 10 is okay, 8 or 9 is great, lower than 7 could indicate someone struggling. Now, when I ask people to give me a score of 1 to 10, I don't say for their mental health, because the moment you say mental health, they panic. But if you talk about energy levels, for example, but it's very subjective. Your 8 might be your 6, might be your 7. But it's about knowing each other, and again, it's about looking for change. If someone who was always a 7 or 8 out of 10, one day in a meeting said they were only 4, I wouldn't say anything to someone in the meeting, but I'd say to them later that day, noticed you're only a 4 earlier today, is everything okay? And when you're using the language of numbers, people are more likely to open up to you. I got a lovely email from a mum recently who said to me, David, thank you so much. After your session, I went home and I asked my 12-year-old daughter how happy she was out of 10. And it led to the most honest conversation I've ever had with my daughter about her well-being, because we use the language of numbers. Another guy I used to work with was always a 10 out of 10. In every meeting he was a 10, and I'll be honest, that used to piss me off, because no one should always
a 10?
Exactly, no one should always be a 10. One day, it was a conference call, in fact, one that shows you how old it was, but one day he was a 9, and I can remember laughing because I thought, wow, this guy who's always a 10 is only a 9. His life must be falling apart. A few days later, he left the business because something major had happened in his life. What I should have done, rather than laugh, I should have rang him and said, you're always a 10, but you're only a 9. Is everything okay? Because his 9 was probably someone else's 3. Right. So it's a very simple language to use with each other, to check in with each other, to see how we're doing.
Liz, given that many people listening will work for Deloitte, interested in what we're doing here at Deloitte to support our employees. You mentioned earlier, obviously, that having an EAP is one thing, but what more is the firm doing to support?
Well, I think the firm is always reviewing what they have on offer in terms of support. So we have mental health champions that trained. I've been trained as a mental health champion, so there's the list of people. There's a lot of signposting. If there are any issues, people can speak to them and they can have confidential conversations to change the working arrangement that they're in, or speak to their line manager at the time. We have Bupa health insurance for all of our employees, which includes a mental health component. We have obviously an employee assistance program, which is talk about financial stress as well as other topics. It's not just mental health, because financial issues lead into mental health, then bereavements, etc. All of these things are connected, and relationship between serious physical illness as well, like cancer and other long-term conditions. You're more likely to have depression or mental health alongside. So there's a range of different things, but I think the firm is always looking to see what they can do more. Then there's the Headspace app. There's a range of different things, but I think Deloitte, like all employers, is on a journey really to try and improve what they're able to offer. One of the things I really appreciate actually is the range of topics that gets covered in terms of the 1 hour lunch slots. There's always something that might be relevant to you in those, and I just think we need to do more of that and give access to experts as well. So if people are concerned about a particular issue, someone that they feel that might actually be able to relate around men's health or those types of topics, as well as more generic support.
And David, in your experience working with various different clients, have you seen any programs or initiatives that are working really well and that you wish other organisations would adopt?
I think it goes back again to the educational program for managers, and I'm often asked, how do you seem to get into organisations at quite a senior level? And it's the language you use. Because again, I'm going to say it again, there's still a lot of people who would see this as a soft, fluffy subject. And a big debate I have with so many organisations is, should this training for managers be mandatory or voluntary? Now, mandatory never feels quite right, but if you make it voluntary, the managers you really want to attend this training won't go. So you have to make it mandatory. And the best way to do that is to make it, if you've got like a leadership development program, this becomes an essential module on that leadership development program. And a very well-known travel company, they changed the name of the module from Mental Health Masterclass for Leaders to Driving Energy through our company. And they linked it with driving energy. And suddenly managers who may have been a little bit cynical thought, oh, this is about performance. I think it's great when organisations have mental health first aiders, and I think you should have. But there are organisations out there who have just got mental health first aiders, and they think we've dealt with it now. And a phrase I love about the wellbeing journey for all organisations is walk as far as you can see, and then you can see further. We're in the fastest changing world we've ever known at the moment, and I think we just need all to keep walking in the right direction because we don't know what's ahead.
It's interesting you mentioned the word performance there, because we'll get to the big question at the end of the episode. But in terms of, we've talked a bit about kindness and what that looks like, but high performing, what does that actually, what does it look like? What does it mean? And then perhaps when we get to the end of the episode, we can talk about the link with kindness. But what does high performing mean to you?
Well, I think high performing means setting ambitious goals and being able to meet them, both as an individual and as an organisation or as a team. And in order to do that, you need to have psychological safety, you need to feel safe to be able to make mistakes, time to be creative, time to be able to look after yourself, and a good environment in which you can work together and communicate to be able to do that. And I think the evidence is showing that actually organisations that are kinder tend to be more creative, tend to have better communication, tend to be better performing over the longer term. And I think it's very difficult to measure this kind of intangible within the culture of an organisation and tie it back to organisational performance. But there is an increasing amount of evidence that actually ties the two together and shows that if you have a better culture, you are better performing, you're more innovative, your people are happier, they're more engaged, they're more productive.
Again, sorry, David, I've obviously been stalking you, but I've been listening to some of the things that you've said previously, and your story about the client you worked with during the pandemic. You said, look, forget about sales targets. I just want to care about you as employees. And what was the outcome of that? Maybe you can elaborate a bit.
During the pandemic, a CEO called Andy Alderson from a company called Vanarama, he put out a video, and he put it on LinkedIn as well, that said to his staff, at the moment, I don't care about sales. I just care about you, my people, and your families. He said, my priority during the next few years, whatever, is going to be to make sure we've still got a great business at the end of this. And he said, I'm going to say it again, at the moment I don't care about sales. Well, sales went up because people so believed in him.
Yeah.
It was also Andy, by the way, who once rang me up and said, David, he said, as you know, as a CEO, I really embrace everything you say about creating kinder cultures. He said, but I'm currently having to restructure the business, and it's going to result in letting some people go. And at the moment, I'm sitting here not feeling very kind. And I said, Andy, you're being kind because you're being kind to the overall business. And sometimes being kind is making the right decisions. I've sat with people in my career and sat down with them and said, look, I don't think you're in the right job for you. I think you're a great person, but you're just not performing because you're not in the right job for you. That was a very difficult but honest conversation, but I was being kind as well. So again, being kind is not being soft, it's being honest.
Yes.
We mustn't confuse that.
That's such an important distinction.
We are rapidly running out of time.
Yeah.
One final thing I wanted to ask before we come back to our big question was, we've spoken about kind of individual behaviours, things we can do as people. We've spoken about organisations, what they can do, what they should be doing more of. What about the role of governments and policymakers and what they can be doing? And Liz, in your line of work, what are you seeing? What's working well? What should we be expecting?
Well, I can't say what we should be expecting, but I think that we should expect to see a better focus on mental health, particularly for children and young people going forward, given the crisis we're seeing in our children and young people today. And I think that the current government has actually set the intention to look very strongly at policy in both the adult space and the children and young people space. But for employers, I think it's really important that employers are incentivised in the right way to make an investment in their people. And I think we don't have that much in terms of the policy today to get employers to actually look at what they could be doing more. And I think we could do more in that space. And I think that's really important because employees' expectations of what their employer does are increasing. And I think employers are also looking at themselves, knowing that employees are expecting more from themselves and asking, should we be doing more? And I think if the government helps them to do more through incentives and the way that it develops policy, I think we could see big shifts.
So just before we do get into the final question, as we wrap up, I wonder if I could ask both of you if there is one piece of advice that you'd give to someone who is struggling with their mental health right now, or know someone who is. What actions can people take?
The oldest phrase in the world to do with mental health, we all know it, but we don't necessarily associate with mental health, is a problem shared, is a problem halved. Generally, from what I see, the moment we start sharing with somebody how we're really feeling, straight away we do start to feel a little bit better. I would say to people, don't suffer in silence. I suffered in silence for 36 years, not talking to anybody, including my ex-wife. We've got to find ways to make it easier for people to talk about their true mental health, with anything we can do to do that.
Liz, is there anything you'd add to that?
Completely agree. I think there's an important role about understanding what you need to do to keep yourself well. And over the last year, I developed something very simple that works for me. It's the 10 of Zen, 10 signs that I'm doing okay. And if you don't know what your 10 signs that you're doing okay, go out and learn them. Give yourself the permission to figure out what makes you feel good.
That's great advice.
Love it.
I love that. So finally, to wrap up, back to our big question, which is, can you be kind and high-performing? Liz?
I think you need kindness, both on a personal level to yourself and to individuals, and also as an organisation and a team, to be high-performing over the long term. I think you can probably be high-performing for short periods without that kindness, but to be high-performing over the long term, absolutely essential.
David?
I believe you only optimise the performance of your people when you create a kind culture. A very quick story. Very early in my career, another manager at the same level of me came up to me and said, "The trouble with you, David, is you're too kind." And I used to hate that. And a few weeks later, that same manager said to me, "David, can I ask you a question?" I said, "Go on then." They said, "When you go out the office, your team work just as hard as when you're in the office. When I go out the office, I know my team do bugger all. How do you achieve that, David?" And I said, "Well, maybe I'm just too kind."
Yes.
Yeah.
Nice. Last word.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a brilliant conversation. I wish we could keep going.
Same.
But yeah, thank you for all your insights. It's been a real pleasure having you today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Green Room by Deloitte. We release a new episode every other Tuesday with another big question, so don't forget to hit follow or subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening or watching. That way, you'll be alerted whenever a new episode drops. This podcast is produced by our very own Pod Squad. Original music by Ali Barrett.